I'm immensely honored to be here today to stand in the footsteps of the luminaries who have preceded me at this podium, including the President of the Appeals Court. Well, welcome, Madam. And to address members of a profession that since the days of the much-mentioned Sir Christopher Alexander Sapara Williams has played such an important role in the life of our country. This conference is reputed to be the world's largest gathering of lawyers. And we have so many brilliant minds in this room. Let me appreciate the Nigerian Bar Association for its efforts to tackle some of the justice issues in this country. And congratulate the President, Yakubu Meke, who I understand it means handsome man. Yes, and he's tall and handsome. But the women who have organized this meeting are even more handsome. Mrs. Oyinka Sola and her team. Please give them a round of applause. I want to thank President Mekewu for his sterling leadership and the constructive approach the organization has taken during his tenure, and also to congratulate President-elect Mazi Afam Osigwe. Now, I've been told to speak for 25 to 30 minutes. So I just want to alert you. I think after 15 minutes, people's attentions begin to wander. But that's what I was told, so you have to listen to me for a bit. Now, every one of us here in this room knows that Nigeria today is not where it should be. That our country has not progressed as it should have. That is why, more than 60 years after independence, the NBA annual general conferences are still looking at themes like rebuilding Nigeria, charting a course for nation building. I say this not in recrimination or even in futile regret, but rather as part of moving our country and advancing its interests. We are living in very difficult times, locally here in Nigeria, but also globally. We have seen protests in this country a few weeks ago, but we have also seen protests elsewhere on this continent and beyond. These difficulties should make us think deeply and reflect on what is needed to move this country forward. So we can have the right type of conversation, not about blame games or recrimination, but about what we actually need to do to tackle present and emerging problems to assure a bright future for our young people in this country. That is why my speech today is entitled, A Social Contract for Nigeria's Future. I know our friends, gentlemen of the press and ladies of the press are here, and I salute them for their hard work. I'm not here to castigate or blame anyone, so I don't want you to spin my words or put out headlines that don't reflect what I'm saying or about to say. I'm here to speak to all governments of my country, all political parties, all Nigerians about a positive way forward for the country. If we look back to the early years of independence, it's clear Nigeria had what it takes to succeed, and yet we've fallen behind countries that were on par with us back then. I want to remind people that in the first half of the 1960s, our per capita income in $1960 was roughly equal to that of South Korea, in the neighborhood of $100 to $120 per capita, according to World Bank data. But then South Korea's growth took off as it went from exporting primary products like tungsten ore and dried seaweed to manufactured goods. Back then, it was textiles and footwear, compared to today's integrated circuits, electronics, ships, and autos, not to mention services exports. such as gaming, entertainment, etc., where South Korea is also strong. Meanwhile, Nigeria's export basket went in the opposite direction and became less diversified. In the early 1960s, mining exports made up half of our exports, and food and animal or vegetable oils together about a third, with manufacturers accounting for 5 to 7%. But since 1974, oil has dominated, often accounting for 97 to 100% of Nigerian exports, with its share rarely dipping below 90%. The good news is that our economy itself is quite diversified, and with the capacity to do much more in terms of agricultural exports, critical minerals, services such as entertainment, etc. And I want to commend ongoing efforts by this government to diversify the exports of our country. Last year, Nigeria's per capita GDP was 1,620 US dollars, while South Korea's was 33,000. Korea's growth miracle was exceptional and world-beating, but even more modest performers have outpaced us. Thailand's per capita GDP was comparable to Nigeria's in the early 1970s and is now $7,200. Peru, a country I will come back to, was about even with Nigeria in the early 1980s, but now has a per capita GDP of nearly 7,800. Even India, which into the 1990s and 2000s had a per capita GDP well below Nigeria's, recently surpassed us on that mark and is now 2,484. India is now the third largest economy in the world, one of the fastest growing and modernizing economies. I cite all these numbers, not because GDP is a perfect measure, but because, as Daniel Susskind, a scholar on economic growth at King's College London, recently put it, and I quote, GDP is correlated with almost every measure of human flourishing. So whether we like it or not, it does tell us an important story, and it affords us a measure of comparison. Many of the big questions the NBA is grappling with at this conference have at their root Nigeria's failure to sustain rates of economic growth and development that consistently outpace the growth of our population. We have had episodes of reform and faster economic growth that were not merely a function of the price of oil, but we were unable to consolidate and build on them. And millions, indeed scores of millions of our compatriots have paid the price in terms of diminished job prospects and human well-being. For example, in the decade between 2000 and 2014, we had an average GDP growth rate of 3.84%, well above our population growth rate of 2.6% per annum, meaning that people were, on average, truly improving their standards of living. During the following decade, average annual GDP per capita growth has been negative, around minus 0.9%, meaning people were worse off because we were not able to sustain prior positive growth momentum. A very important part of the explanation for why we've not been able to succeed is lack of policy consistency. Successive administrations failing to continue good, and I emphasize good economic and social policies put in place by predecessors, allowing politics to frame policy, what we can call the not made in my administration syndrome. We all understand that where policies are bad and not working, of course, politics should intervene. But where things are working to the good, we ask, why fix what is not broken? To minimize the volatility of economic and social policy, and to set our country on a steady growth and development path, rather than an episodic growth path, I have become increasingly convinced that Nigeria needs a social contract. By this, I mean a fundamental cross-party, cross-society agreement that certain things in the economy, in the country, in policy and in society are sacrosanct and shall not be touched or changed when administrations change. And the private sector and Nigeria's civil society, including influential actors like the NBA, have important roles to play in policing a social contract and holding the political class accountable. The idea of a social contract dates back at least a few centuries when philosophers such as Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes spelled out the notion of a compact, formal or implicit, defining the rights and duties of rulers and the ruled. A more focused definition for our purposes comes from the former head of the London School of Economics and the former president of Columbia University, my former World Bank colleague, Minu Shafiq. She describes the social contract as being about how we pool our resources to provide the public goods we agree are needed, and how we support those affected by adverse shocks. Her book, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract for a Better Society, argues that in our fast-changing globalized economy, we need a new social contract to create a sense of security among people. What I'm calling for here is even more basic. I'm saying that all major actors in the governance of our country should agree on some basic parameters for security, macroeconomic and social stability, and the enabling environment for future dynamism and growth of our country. Once agreed, these parameters and policies should be institutionalized or enshrined in law, or even be made part of our constitution, not to be tampered with, except perhaps through a national referendum involving the entire country and society. My convictions on Nigeria's need for a social contract were reinforced recently when I was in Peru on an official visit. Looking at the country as a Nigerian, I was struck by the mismatch between its politics and its economic performance. Politics in Peru has been and is extremely messy and toxic. The country has had 6 presidents in the past 7 years. The current president took office amid violent protests after her predecessor was arrested and jailed for attempting to dissolve Congress and rule by decree. The government and opposition are constantly at each other's throats, with regular impeachment proceedings and frequent social unrest. You would think that a country with such messy politics would be an economic laggard at best, or economic disaster at worst. But to my shock, when I looked at the numbers, it was not. I mentioned earlier how Peru's per capita GDP is now almost 5 times higher than ours, even though we were roughly even in the 1980s. According to IMF numbers, Peru's modest GDP growth rates of 2.5 to 2.7% over the last couple of years is coupled with very good macroeconomic indicators. Its current account deficit is a modest 1.1% of GDP. Its fiscal deficit is 2.5% of GDP, below the recommended 3%, and its debt to GDP ratio is 33%. According to data from its central bank, Peru's foreign exchange reserves as of this month are at 77.4 billion, most of them usable reserves, and our inflation is 2%. The IMF praised Peru's economic management, saying in its Article 4 report, and I quote, "Inflation has receded thanks to the central bank's decisive monetary policy tightening, while the fiscal position and the financial system remain strong." With respect to macroeconomic fragility, Peru has ample buffers to cope with adverse shocks, including relatively low public debt, abundant international reserves, and access to international capital markets on favorable terms, unquote. When I asked top officials in the country, how come the economic performance is so good in the face of such political turmoil? They said that Peru had learned lessons from its past unfortunate economic experiences, and there was now a kind of implicit social contract that certain aspects of economic and social governance must not be touched. Peru learned the lessons of its lost decade of the 1980s and put in place an ambitious series of structural reforms, including the policies and institutional frameworks that helped the country navigate difficult times. In 1999, it introduced a fiscal rule, placing agreed limits on fiscal deficits and public expenditures, along with an escape hatch for economic emergencies such as COVID-19. Certain forms of expenditures for social goods, infrastructure maintenance, and security were exempted from the fiscal rule, but managed transparently. On the monetary side, Peru in 2002 made its central bank independent and formally introduced a 2% inflation target, plus or minus 1%. Peru's reforms laid the foundation for years of stronger growth and poverty reduction. Even though growth lost speed after 2014 amid declining mining prices and slowing external demand, per capita incomes increased by a factor of 3.5 in the 20 years after 2002, lifting the country to upper middle income status. The central factor underpinning the performance was the implicit social contract that the policy reforms put in place that strengthened institutions should not be touched. For us as Nigerians, the real surprise must be that Peru's different political parties, for all their vicious opposition to each other, broadly supported the hard-won structural reforms and honored the fiscal and monetary policy frameworks when in power. They accepted that certain things should be respected for the good of the country and should not be played with, no matter how rough the politics. That cross-party commitment to strong macroeconomic foundations is something we need in Nigeria. During President Obasanjo's second term, we carried out strong structural reforms very similar to Peru's. A $30 billion external debt was cleared, that was mentioned earlier. The central bank was made independent. The multiple exchange rate regime became a thing of the past as a flexible, rational managed float regime was put in place. An oil price-based fiscal rule was also put in place, along with a medium-term expenditure framework, leading to a strong accumulation of savings and foreign exchange reserves. We discussed and observed notional guidelines to enable sustainable debt levels, with a target for debt to GDP ratio not to exceed 33 to 40%, suitable for a country at Nigeria's stage of development, and debt service to revenue ratio not to exceed 33%. Actual debt to GDP and debt service to revenue numbers were far below these notional guidelines. These policies were maintained under subsequent administrations of Yar'Adua and Jonathan, and even more reforms were carried out to strengthen and modernize the economy. Strong social safety nets were built. Well-targeted social programs such as Shopee, You Win, and Saving 1 Million Lives, the latter targeting pregnant women and children. Am I saying that these administrations were perfect? Of course not. They had their problems, imperfections, and challenges. And as a finance minister, I was part of struggling with those challenges. But there was a consistency of policy that led to the economic numbers I quoted earlier in this speech. What I'm saying is this: maintaining good economic and social policies, that is, maintaining policy consistency, and adding more reforms on top of that will lead us along the path of good progress that we all desire. As we know, our political leaders have thus far never been able to agree to stick to a common set of principles and policies that deliver on a consistent basis for citizens, irrespective of ethnic group or political persuasion. And our big civil society groups like the NBA have not been able to hold politicians accountable. And I'm not going to flatter you, because Segments of our legal system have also become beholden to those same politicians. But it is never too late to do the right thing. Instead of fighting over who gets what share of an ever smaller cake, it's about time this country had a meeting of all parties to agree a social contract that can help us focus on baking a larger cake. I will devote my remaining remarks to looking at potential elements of such a social contract. In line with my comparative advantage as an economist, I will focus on economic policies, though I'll offer a few thoughts on related areas as well. Note that I'm not trying to be exhaustive on what constitutes a social contract, just to give you some examples. Let me say here that trust will be a prerequisite for any social contract for rebuilding Nigeria, meeting our economic development challenges, and building a brighter future for the rising generations of young people. All political parties, all ethnic groups will have to honor this contract, no matter who is in government. The importance of trust in our country, given its size and diversity, has been clear since day one. Even before independence, in his first speech as Prime Minister in 1957, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa said, and I quote, "The peoples of Nigeria must be united to enable this country to play a full part in shaping the destiny of mankind. It is the duty of all of us to work for unity and encourage members of all our communities to live together in peace and harmony. The way to do this is to create understanding, mutual respect, and trust." This is Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa in 1957. Trust comes not from words, but from deeds. That is from accomplishing things together, building together. A social contract could become a basis for the virtuous circles of reform, growth, peace, security, and trust that have too long eluded us. Turning now to potential ingredients of that social contract. The first element should be a shared understanding that we must prioritize the security of lives, property, and national assets. We cannot have economic or social development without security. And we certainly cannot have security without development. We all know that. Security has been weaponized in our country for political purposes by political actors, leading partly to the difficult situation we have now. We have politicians who believe that the best way to make their opponents look bad is to instigate insecurity, making it look like they can't govern, regardless of whether this leads to loss of life and property of innocent Nigerians. This has to stop. A second aspect of security relates to security of national assets. Nigerians have seen for years how organized crude oil theft on a massive scale seriously undermines the economic and financial health of the country. All Nigerians must agree that stealing of our national assets of any type is intolerable and must be stopped. How can we be struggling to see how to strengthen our foreign exchange reserves with the governor of the central bank working so hard on this, when so much is being lost through oil theft? There is so much technology available now to track such theft, and there must be no more excuses for inaction. Theft of electricity cables is another rampant and very dangerous form of pilfering of national assets. I can share two personal experiences. 2 weeks ago, the cables near our house in the village, in Omoda Isingu, were caught, depriving our house and all the other houses in the village of electricity. They were caught and stolen. Yesterday, my husband called me from Abuja that there had been a major explosion near his clinic in Gwarimpa. And what was it? Some people cut the cables linked to the transformer, and the transformer exploded. They barely escaped with their lives. This kind of taking and stealing of national assets is unbelievably dangerous for those doing it, and it must be a mark of desperation and failure to see the bigger picture that leads people to do this. I'm pleading with all Nigerians that this has to stop. It's even endangering your own life to engage in this type of act. The second element of the social contract involves the basic organs of the economy. They should be left to work so as to produce the best economic and social results for the country, as I described in the case of Peru. First, we must continue to support the central bank and its work, and support its independence. No one should try to tamper with the central bank, asking for manipulation of interest rates or the exchange rate. Do not use the central bank as a fiscal agent, asking for printing of naira beyond agreed ways and means limits, as this can fuel inflation. Fundamental fiscal and financial rules should be respected once they're on the books. Respect the use of the oil price-based fiscal rule that allows the accumulation of reserves and savings in good times to be used to cushion bad times. Respect the agreed budget deficit. Keep it as close to 3% of GDP as possible. Limit non-transparent extra budgetary spending, spent through the budget. Stick to transparency of FAC allocations and state and federal budgets so that citizens have a clear view of how their money is being spent. Do not exceed sensible limits for public debt as a percent of GDP. For an economy at Nigeria's stage of development and given its vulnerability, debt to GDP ratios should remain well below 40%. Debt service to revenue, we should strive not to exceed 33% so as not to crowd out operational and capital expenditures. Budget on the basis of a medium-term expenditure framework so as to provide a sound, forward-looking platform for economic and budget management. Create an investment-friendly business environment, cutting down on bureaucracy, licensing and policy uncertainty to encourage the domestic and foreign private sector to invest and remain in Nigeria. Respect of the above will ensure a sound macroeconomic framework with core economic management working on an objective basis to become a foundation for investment, growth, and employment. The third element of the social contract is provision of basic infrastructure services and a social safety net to catch segments of society that are super vulnerable. What is required is ongoing investment in and maintenance of the country's basic infrastructure assets for electricity, water, roads, and telecommunications. Nigerians don't expect much from government. We are used to sometimes being our own local government. But trust between those governing and those governed would be enormously increased if we had a better maintenance culture of the few infrastructure assets we have, and full transparency and information about when and how many hours a day, for example, we would not have light or we would have light, and information on why this is happening. Crafting and maintenance of social safety net programs for the most vulnerable, children and pregnant and nursing mothers. Working with states and local communities to ensure the truly vulnerable are reached. Conditional cash transfer programs can be some of the best means to do this, especially if coupled with biometrics. Community work programs for rural youth and entrepreneurship programs for young women and men, given the abundance of entrepreneurial talent in Nigeria. Part of a social contract must be continuous attention to youth unemployment and underemployment. Let me end my suggestions with a fourth element of the social contract: true independence of the judiciary and the Electoral Commission. All parties must agree that these institutions should not be tampered with, win or lose. As I said earlier, civil society, and in particular the Nigerian Bar Association, have a major responsibility to monitor observance of the social contract, especially the element of the Judiciary and Electoral Commission. The NBA should also be active in seeing which elements of the social contract can be institutionalized by codifying it into law or strengthening already existing laws, rules, and regulations. The NBA can even look at whether any part should be incorporated into our Constitution to make them less easy to tamper with. The legal profession, led by the NBA, should be at the forefront of guaranteeing the social contract. This would be in keeping with what you have been quoting here, and I have it in my speech, Sapara Williams' maxim that, quote, a lawyer lives for the direction of his people and her people and the advancement of the cause of the country. Now, I don't mean to oversell this idea of a social contract for Nigeria. I'm not saying it's a panacea that will suddenly cure all ills. But I'm convinced it will enable us to build a strong and stable foundation for Nigeria upon which it can thrive. A Nigeria of the future with steady and consistent growth and social development that will take us back to middle-income status and beyond. Of course, we will also need to take other actions to improve our education and health system, nurture our investments in physical and human capital. We will need to connect to the new and fast-changing world of technology. But believe me, I'm actually not worried about Nigeria's ability to catch up once the basic governance and economic and social foundation is there. We have some of the most creative, most intelligent, and most entrepreneurial people in the world. Some of them in this very room. That is why I'm always proud to be a Nigerian. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying that what I just laid out before you is not rocket science. Some of what we need to implement as part of the social contract has been done in past administrations, as I mentioned earlier, and some of it is being implemented in this present administration. But we cannot approach the social contract in a piecemeal fashion, a bit here and a bit there. It must be approached holistically, systematically, and consistently in order for it to work. All political parties and politicians, all Nigerians must agree that these elements we identify and others to be added as forming the social contract must be respected by all who govern, no matter their politics, for the good of those they govern. You, the NBA, the biggest gathering of lawyers in the world, the largest, most influential civil society organization in Nigeria, you bear a heavy responsibility to advocate for and ensure that this social contract comes about. My question to you is, are you ready? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.